So thank you for the background. So what I'll talk about a bit today is policing and human rights and how do we improve them. Now my specialization is in police in non-Western contexts, but I'll talk a little bit about police in the United States, or rather there's a couple of things to mention which are particularly important and different about the United States. So number one is the United States has by far and away the greatest number of police forces. I think it was in the region of around 16,000 plus. And no other country has that level of fragmentation or breaking it down into federal and state and so on levels. And that obviously affects the governance of policing, because in other countries, the government may have control over one police force or 50 or 100. The other factor which makes the United States very different from other contexts is just the sheer amount of weaponry that exists in the country. So if a police officer in the United Kingdom responds to a domestic incident, it's extremely unlikely that they will be come across anything which involves a firearm. Now, it might also be unlikely in the United States as well, but it's much more likely, and that affects the game theory almost of day-to-day policing. But let me come back to police in non-Western contexts. It's important to try not to look at policing entirely through the lens of your own country. And three factors in particular are quite different about police in non-Western countries. So and they don't all exist in all of these countries. Number one is the degree of repression. Now, obviously that varies massively from no repression to quite considerable repression. But compared to police in North America and Western Europe, the degree of repression is markedly different, and in some cases can be far greater. It's also important, though, trying not to look at policing entirely through the lens of state and individual, or state and society. Because in many places in the world, and this is the second factor, the states are extremely fragile or weak. In fact, they aren't able to pay their police or control them. And the third factor is that in many parts of the world, there are far higher levels of corruption, or what political scientists call neo-patrimonial politics. So the country is essentially run by a number of often competing patronage networks. And they may or may not, but often are, involved in high levels of police corruption over resources. So all three factors affects the conduct of ordinary police officers. Political oppression is fairly obvious. If the state directs and has control over its police, the police will follow a certain direction. Where states are weak and there are high levels of corruption, police can be involved in high levels of organized crime. And they can also be involved in predatory policing, which is basically when they are preying on the population for resources. And I'll give an example from my research in the former Soviet Union. In many parts of the former Soviet Union, particularly in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was quite common for police to pay for their jobs. And the most lucrative source or posts, such as those where you're policing migrants who may not have the correct documentation or they're illegally, and therefore you could shake them down more easily, those were the most lucrative. And what you had were pyramids of corruption whereby you'd pay to get into the police, then you'd pay to get another role, and then you'd have to keep on going and going. And this is that common in other contexts, such as in Latin America and certain African countries. So what do we do about it? It's challenging. So the first thing I think to emphasize is when we're talking about police and human rights, we're talking about police abuse of human rights often, but we're also talking about police upholding and supporting the protection of human rights. Police are important. Where trust is high, police function quite well by clamping down on the tiny percentage of individuals who are responsible for most violence, and by policing effectively hotspots where most violence is likely to occur. So at a city level, for example, certain nightclubs or certain transportation networks, hubs, sorry. But the thing about this only works well if there's a high degree of trust, because police by themselves rely on intelligence, and that only works well when they have good intelligence from the public. So to improve police observation of ability to uphold human rights, we need to improve police trust. Now, that's obviously incredibly difficult at the moment in the United States, but it's incredibly difficult in contexts where the police are actually responsible for large-scale violence and large-scale corruption. So we've got a number of problems on our hands. Now, when we come to actually looking at, well, okay, what do we do about it? I've got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is actually, from an academic perspective, we still don't really know. So even in the United States, research on how to reduce police violence indicates that a lot of the measures that are typically tried, like body cameras, de-escalation training, early interventions, tackling implicit bias and civilian oversight, the evidence in support of these organizational level changes is actually not particularly strong. And the vast bulk of research on police comes from the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe. But if it's not strong in the United States and Europe, where the research is strongest, it is even more unclear in other parts of the world where the research is not so strong. So number one is, and this is often the case with academics, is we need more research, particularly on police violence. But we can't wait for research. So there's a couple of other things that are important here. So number one is research partnerships can be quite useful. Now that's where you get a researcher who has the skills, knowledge of criminal justice, but also the aptitude to work with very busy policymakers. And they work together at unpicking or identifying the key issues and coming up with the solution to the world. In developing countries, sometimes political will is absolutely essential for meaningful reform. You can't really reform the police where there is the absence of it. But of course, that will isn't there in a lot of places. And what happens a lot in the international assistance area is that a lot of money is wasted on projects that were never really going to work because the government wasn't interested and was actively blocking reform. The good news is that where there is increasingly better quality and more civil society action in many of these countries, and where that can be supported to put pressure on political leaders, we can see results. It's no walk in the park, but I think that's a much more effective way of looking at trying to address issues of police abuse where there is lacking political will. I'll shortly end. My only final thing is I'm involved in a research project called howtoreformthepolice.com, which does exactly what it says on the website, which aims to bring together the research at that more organizational level and the broader factors of what impact reform. So I'd urge you to have a look. It's still in pilot and test phase, but that's one way I'm trying to work out how we can bring together that academic expertise, but also synthesize it and make it accessible to policymakers and to civil society, and give them the best available evidence so that they can go on and do their good work. Thanks.